with us David Simoes-Brown, who's an old friend and somebody who knows quite a lot about open innovation. Indeed, the organisation he's working with, 100% open, kind of says it all. And David's been in this game a long time, has seen from the early days how open innovation has evolved. So I think you said, David, the company's now 12 years old. What's changed in the wonderful world of open innovation since we last had the opportunity to chat about it?
Thank you, John. Great pleasure to be talking to you again. It's 9 or so years since we last spoke. We're our 12th year of operations. That's 100% open, so there must be something in it. I guess when we started 100% open, spin out of Leicester, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, a dozen years ago, we weren't sure whether open innovation was going to be a fad or a flash in the pan or the latest management mantra, but it's turned out to be a kind of solid strategy for innovation that most organisations have now adopted and are developing expertise in. So I think it's here to stay. I'm pleased it's here to stay. And it's now seen, I think, not as a sort of magic pill, but as a sensible part of the innovation armoury. So I've never pretended that open is the way for everything. Sometimes you've got to be secretive, you've got to be closed, you've got to be competitive. But increasingly, I think people are seeing the role for open innovation within a broader portfolio. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with the increasingly networked world that we live in. So there are probably 3 trends, since you ask, that I've written down. So one is globalisation. So increasingly we are getting inquiries and working for global organisations, and it's very nice to see the adoption curve sort of ripple out from the States and the UK into Middle and Far East in particular, in South America in particular, less so in Africa for some reason. That's come to that in a minute, but it's interesting. It's like a sort of earthquake that has gone out into the world, and that's been interesting to see and good to see. So it's a global. It used to be the province and of the Americans and us, but it's now absolutely international standard, which is great. Second thing is, it started off, for me anyway, started off in the private sector. So it was the great pharma companies, the large automotive companies that really saw a requirement for innovating with new supply chains and so forth. But now I think governments are interested, government departments are interested, policymakers are interested. People who pull the strings and create the business environment are getting interested. And they're opening their minds to all sorts of things, actually, these guys, not least design thinking and other semi-related bits of business, philosophy. But yeah, very interested in open innovation and how that can, the principles behind and the tools that are used in open innovation can help governments do their thing. All the way from procurement, literally, let's procure from small businesses, all the way through to setting the policy environment for the collaboration, intellectual property rules, that kind of thing. So globalization, it's a sort of spread into different organizational types, I suppose. And the third thing is the nature of what's being openly innovated has shifted from stuff to services, and from widgets to business models. So what's interesting now is the sort of content of open innovation, the thing that's being innovated, as I said, has moved beyond, drug discovery and, bits of rockets through to, particularly in the light of the development of service design over the past 10 years as well. So open innovation has embraced the collaborative development of services, And as I say, business models not quite yet, but it's certainly happening. So looking at how you innovate the way companies operate rather than just what they produce is really the third trend. I wanted to just nod to. There's probably more.
No, it's fascinating to see how much it has spread, and it's moved very much to the mainstream and embraces the public as well as the private sector. I guess then the question is, where are the challenges now? They clearly in the early days was nobody knew about it, and how do you first sort of stimulate it? Now we're a long way up that diffusion curve. Where are the challenges in open innovation?
That's a good question. I think they're methodological. So what's the best way of doing it, and how much should you use off-the-shelf tools versus how much should you create a way that's right for your organisation. So methodologically, there are various learning curves. We have our Creative Commons 100% Open Innovation Toolkit, which has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times and is one of the ways we've tried to create a standard. But actually, it's probably better for organisations to develop their own way of open innovating and their own sort of cultural way of being. How open do you want to be? Is the question for a lot of organisations. So there's a methodological challenge. I think there might be beginning to be a sort of supply challenge in that a lot of the sparkiest SMEs and startups, the most interesting things out there, especially think about fintech. We've been running the UBS Future of Finance FinTech Challenge for 5 years. And 5 years ago, I got the sense that you weren't really competing for SMEs against other financial services organisations. You were giving them an opportunity. But now, of course, there are so many open innovation competitions around that the best startups have a choice. They have a sort of slightly more calculating view about their opportunity costs for taking part in these competitions. And with the best of the world, only 1 in sort of 50 will win an open innovation competition. So what happens to the other 49? So I think there's beginning to be a bit of savviness on the behalf of the best startups to be more choosy and to be more discerning about how they engage with large firms. It can take 3 or 4 weeks to really put together a decent proposal for an open innovation challenge, and that's in a small business a lot of time. And for example, there's a lot of people, a lot of different companies creating specialist open innovation platforms for different sectors. So I was at a crowdsourcing week conference last week, all about security space, and I thought, well, this is interesting. Open innovation, cyber security, surely not. But no, there are several platforms I learned that specialise solely in cybersecurity startups, and these cybersecurity startups will often be on more than one platform at a time. So they are rationing their attention, and it's so therefore the onus has become on large organisations to ask more interesting questions, to have more. Have a better offer. So it's become competitive. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. So are we taking advantage of the goodwill of all those startups out there? Are we really helping them get networked and achieve fame and fortune, or are we wasting their time? And I think there's got to be a lot. Yeah, I think obviously the supply of startups is pretty inexhaustible. You would hope, but the best ones need to be encouraged in a slightly more humane is the wrong word, but in a slightly more equal, mutually respectful fashion. So I think that's another trend. the playing field perhaps has become a little more level. That as economic situation change, I mean, COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example. Organisations need to be fleet of foot. They need to pivot quickly. I've lost count of the number of times organisations have said to me and others, we need to be as agile as a startup, which is obviously nonsense. You can't be as agile as a startup if you're running a massive corporation. But the way you can access that agility is to work with startups, right? So treating the startup as more of a partner and less of a supplier, I think that's the lessons that we've learned.
No, that's fascinating. Perhaps on that last point, there is a sort of a caricature, I can almost say, which is the wonderful thing about open innovation is there's all these people out there, so we don't have to do anything. We'll just ask them to do it for us. That kind of the lazy center model, that clearly has some disadvantages. But I wonder how much of the challenge now has become, as you're implying there, the challenge to the receiver, the one drawing in all this wonderful stuff from outside, to change themselves and to make good use of it. It's this kind of absorptive capacity.
Absolutely. You cannot embrace open innovation and start working in startups without radically re-engineering your culture. Otherwise, you just bounce off. There's no point. You're wasting everyone's time. So, I mean, little things like we did a national open innovation program in Colombia, in South America, called Cuatro, which was working with 11 different organisations over a short space of time, with 33 challenges, in order to sort of shock the country into embracing a different way of innovating. This is for the Colombian government, and it was fascinating in that it worked, but the sort of the business culture in South America and other places actually is pretty conservative. They default to face-to-face. They don't like opening up. They believe that in trade secrecy and being discreet and competitive and all that stuff. And it was interesting to see how since then the business culture and landscape has changed as a result of being shown that it works, and seeing is believing, right? So we're all on Zoom now, and a few months ago everyone thought that, another cliche, business is done mano a mano, and it's not necessarily done. So opening out those cultures was interesting experience in the face of a lot of resistance. So one of the tricks with large organisations is to create a structura gobernamiento, I think it's called, a governance structure. So you basically convene everyone in an organisation that has the power to say no to an external innovation. So the production people, the intellectual property people, the designers, the marketeers, everyone with a say in a new product or service, everyone who has the potential to basically put a spanner in the works at some point, and you make them responsible for that open innovation. And some wonderful stuff happens as a result. They talk to each other about innovation, which practically never happens anyway. And I figured my slightly cynical view. B, they start to get excited about the possibilities and start to help each other out instead of getting in each other's way. So you create a sort of panel is the wrong word, but a little sub-team, a next team, if you like, of people within an organisation that is responsible for the success of it, and suddenly that seems to be one of the cultural switches you can throw in an organisation. The other is just go under the radar, sound at P&G, and make sure you have a success early on, and then tell everyone about it. Certainly the cultural journey is a slow one and requires proof and requires. So just saying, let's do some open innovation and it'll all be marvellous is wasting everyone's time. So what tends to happen, and so this is dying out at the moment, is open innovation as PR. So when we started working with UBS, for example, they were delighted about the exposure. Investment banking is not known for its openness, or nor indeed in Switzerland. And to be number one in the Twitter charts the first time we ran the competition blew their minds, really. And I think what they got out of the first time we ran that competition was exposure, positioning, and network building. And they weren't really expecting too much innovation to come out of it. And that 5-year journey has now resulted in them having accelerators, proper induction programs for SMEs, decent prizes, great sort of mentoring engagement throughout the competitions. So their culture's just changed. They've literally thrown all the doors and windows open, which is great to see. But unless you do that, you will find open innovation a bitter pill to swallow, at least for the first.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, for me, it's always been one of those kind of challenges that we know so much in innovation studies about not invented here, which is all about somehow having this immune system that's really good at rejecting ideas from outside. And then you layer on top of that, open the doors, let it all come in. And you think somewhere there's going to be a clash or something will need to change. And by the sound of it, you're seeing examples. I love the Colombian government one, where things are changing. Fascinating.
Well, there's another one, and one of our associates used to run an Orange Lab, the one in the UK, and he used to describe the innovation antibodies of the organisation that used to cluster around any new idea and eject it immediately. Yeah. And that was solved by setting up specific open R&D organisations around the globe. So you're absolutely right in that you have to. It's not just a question of we've got 3 innovation methodologies and this one's to do with workshops and this one's to do with. It's a fundamentally different approach to how you see business. So that's really exciting. And so there's a competitive marketplace now, I think, in openness. So the most open companies, I predict, see in another 9 years, will be the ones that survive because they're agile, because things are changing fast, because you need to be adaptable. Yeah. If you've got open borders, you've got open attitudes, open minds, open mindsets, you're more likely to be able to follow the trend, even anticipate it as well. The other trend I missed out before, or it's not really a trend, it's the sort of delivery mechanism for open innovation. So there's a lot of platform businesses around, Medallia, Hype, people like that, who have software offerings that facilitate open innovation. Now that is, very exciting because you now can integrate a system into a company that is platform driven, that encompasses all the sort of steps of innovation through. So the Hype, for example, they have a sort of futurology bit. So you can look at trends and all the way through to having an open competition, and then judging and filtering the results, and then running prototype. All this can be done and systematized, if you like. So it's become really, really sophisticated, and that suits corporates very well because they like a system. And to have that as a sort of cultural artifact in a company that binds together all these different people I was talking about before, the marketing, the IP, the production, to have a system that is visible to them, which is about innovation and porous, allowing ideas in and stuff out as well, is going to be revolutionary, I think. I'll talk a bit more about the platforms later, but so open innovation used to be a bunch of workshops, and it's turned into a much more grown-up process.
Yeah. I wonder, you talked about antibodies a moment, and that, of course, we're talking in the midst of this awful crisis, but one of the few good things that's come out of it, at least from my viewpoint, is the way it's catalyzed new connections in the innovation space. And we saw that early on with the ventilators, the protective equipment, the whole business of pulling these vaccines together and getting them out fast. In a sense, that speaks to another side of the open innovation story, which is the sharing across boundaries, across sectors and so on. This is not so much drawing in stuff as sharing the other way. I wonder if you could comment a bit on that. And hopefully, is this something that's going to stay, or is it perhaps just a COVID effect and we're going to default back to a rather protective thing? This idea of sharing across boundaries.
I think you can't go back. Once you've discovered, that you can do workshops online, once you've discovered that you can operate in a different way, it's very difficult to put that cultural genie back into the bottle. So I think people, especially if it works, I mean, this is not a religious thing, it's a pragmatic thing. You don't have to believe in anything, actually, either it works or it doesn't. And it does most of the time. So I think that seeing is believing. And so I'm reminded of, I've done some work with the military. And again, that's kind of interesting, the whole idea of open innovation.
Yes.
The Ministry of Defence. It was very successful work. I don't have much of the budget every minute. So, enabling organisations to experience the effect of being open, and it doesn't really matter why you've gone through that, it's the fact that it happened. So the military call quite surprised, and it's not just the UK, it's around the world, when it's their innovation processes are long and protracted and inefficient and suboptimal in many ways, until there's a war. And what happens is everyone pulls together, and they call it an UOR, an Urgent Operational Requirement. And when you have a UOR, what happens is everything. And instead of getting, the wrong equipment years late at 4 times the price, it arrives miraculously within weeks to do the job. What's that about? It's the same people, the same procurement, the same problems, but more pressure. So I think what the pandemic will do is produce a UOR for business culture, and we'll find resources and creativity and solutions that we couldn't even bother to think about before. I think it's probably what it is. Yeah. It's about motivation. So yeah, that was a successful thing. We worked with DSTL, the MOD's sort of science guys, and they were looking at the question of procurement efficiency and flexibility, because it's hard work. I mean, the same people have to buy millions of army boots as they do ships. So it's a complex job, and so they had a feeling that being more networked and more open would be a useful thing, and it turned out that it solved a number of cultural issues that were getting in the way. Internal communication, not being allowed to talk to anyone about anything, the attitude towards scale. So, would you really buy key components of a ship from, 2 guys in a shed, etc. So there was a lot. I won't go into it now, but there's a lot of resistance to it. Anyway, that's now become DASA, the Defence and Security Accelerator, which is turning over millions and making a real concerted. Having a real impact on the openness and the connectedness of the defence ecosystem. So, if it can happen for the Ministry of Defence, it can happen to you too.
I like your idea of the UOR. I work a lot with the humanitarian sector, and that's their life. And their focus on innovation has hugely been because money is fairly constrained. Can we draw in help from anywhere? And of course, very often that creates some fascinating solutions which then have reverse impacts in the wider world. So I think there's probably something there.
I worked with the Red Cross for a while, CRC for a while, and it strikes me that many of these organisations were born out of a military context. After the war, they were put together and run on very military lines, and there's echoes of that even now. So what we're able to do with ITRC at Geneva is to synchronise or at least socialise the innovation efforts throughout the organisation. So there's a problem with working with Save the Children a bit as well at the moment. The problem with organisations like that is the coordination of innovation and the connectedness of the organisation. Another way in which you can, in which opening up helps your internal culture is that you have to have if you're open, you have to have a consistent and connected message to the outside world, or it's just a complete muddle. So yes, I think if it can work for NGOs, if it can work for Ministry of Defence, and if it can work for everyone else, it's obviously flexible and interesting and mechanical.
Something you've touched on a little while ago, and perhaps one of the two words which really are in the innovation space, everyone you talk to is either talking about platforms or ecosystems. And both of those seem to say something about a much more open, networked, connected way of thinking about innovation, which is kind of moved beyond the individual enterprise. I wonder if you could comment a bit about those two probably very highly interconnected things, platforms and ecosystems.
Definitely. I'll start with ecosystems, because that's a word that is much bandied about and very little understood. So I'm a biologist, so I know what an ecosystem is. In a purest sense, it is an interconnected web of life that, where the outputs of one bit, all the inputs of the next bit, and that useful balance has taken millions of years to create, and it's very finely tuned. Now, the modern business ecosystem is nothing like that. And often people get confused between a network and an ecosystem. In fact, people get confused between a list, a network, and an ecosystem. So let me elucidate. A list is a bunch of people that you have contacted, or you might know, or you have their address details. That is not an ecosystem, because it is dead. It's not living. It's not producing anything. There's no balance. Right? A network is the same thing, but with communication. So suddenly you've got a list of people, and they're for some reason communicating, and that's a network with nodes, with comms going around it. So if you are regularly emailing your list and they are talking to each other and you're providing a forum service for that list, it becomes a bit of a network. So that's the next sort of level up is an ecosystem where actually you're working together and they're dependent not just on information but on business. So an ecosystem is mutually. What's interesting is how the sort of Victorian concept of a supply chain, I don't know whether Victorian you can name more than me, but it sounds Victorian, a chain of supply, it has become much more interesting and diverse and interconnected. So I think the ecosystem as I would define it anyway, is just like a biological ecosystem. The outputs of one become the inputs of the other thing. And it's, so you take one bit away and kind of the whole thing suffers. Which is why businesses like universities adopted the ecosystem approach, because it contains risk. You're depending on other people on what you can control yourself. And in a true ecosystem, if you cut down all the trees, you die of lack of oxygen. So things are literally connected to each other. So in business, to let go of your supply chain in particular, or your distribution mechanic or whatever, to that extent, takes nerve, and that's why ecosystems are universal. So if we were asked to set up an ecosystem, we have been for a particular drinks manufacturer. I think they had in their mind, write me a good list, and actually it's not a list. What it is events, it's reasons to collaborate, it's competitions, it is briefs, it is mutual dependency on a number of levels for thinking and action. for NPD as well. So that's my prejudice on ecosystems. Platforms I've touched on briefly before, but platforms are super interesting because they systematise open innovation. So you have to be careful here because open innovation, the good bits of it, depend on random interaction and serendipity to a certain extent. So the more you try and systematise open innovation, the more predictable it might be, but the less inventive it will become. However, so with that caveat, the systems that you can buy nowadays for open innovation, platforms you can buy for open innovation, are very interesting. Now, I've seen a big shift over the past 10 years, actually. So 10 years ago, talking about an open innovation platform was talking about open competition. So NASA, for example, did a lot of these things where they put out a big question to the outside world, and then amateurs from all over the world would answer it. And therefore, the platforms were externally facing. They had to be good in public. They had to have good accessibility. They had very open attitudes to IP and the background. And it was, but now if you think about the open innovation platform market, so the people I mentioned earlier, the Medallions, the Hypes, the Hero X's, are mostly, I would estimate, 90% selling to internal users. So companies will set up a platform to connect their employees across the globe, and for innovation purposes. And there's a module that you might use that, where you plug in an external competition if you want to, but basically it's about internal comms. That's a radical shift in thinking as to what connected and open innovation is. And arguably it's not open innovation, it's just better internal innovation. However, all these modules that are being sold do have an easy capability of opening a window. So I think in terms of the platform business has changed massively. I suspect what has happened is that these companies have got a whole bunch of investor cash, VC cash. They've spent it on sales operations, and their business model is about license fees. So the bigger the company, the more things on keyboards, the more money we earn. And sometimes that's successful, sometimes it isn't. So they have to borrow a whole bunch more money, and the business model becomes more and more sales predicated and less service predicated. So the platforms that you get now are nicely designed, but you have to know what you're doing when you operate them. So we've formed strategic partnerships with 3 platform companies recently to deliver the strategic services and the challenge design and the kind of business stuff that you have to, and the cultural stuff that you have to get right in order to get make most use of these platforms. So in summary, on the one hand, the platforms have become super sophisticated. It's lovely to have an open innovation sort of system that you can just buy up, rent off the shelf per user, and it's good and it works, and it just and they've got a bunch of case studies, and it's all very reassuring for clients. That's great, but I lament the lack of sort of, I won't say proper, but pure open innovation platforms where they are essentially about mass participation, the discovery of the needle in a haystack, the sort of chance solving of a problem by a teenager in Wisconsin or whatever it is. So I think it shifted from open sort of public challenges and has been appropriated in a good and positive way by firms looking to have a bit of that action, but within their corporate boundaries.
It's, as always, fascinating to hear you. I guess we're slowly running out of time, so perhaps I could just draw this to a temporary close, because I hope we can carry on the conversation in the future. I'm rather heartened, as somebody who professes to help people understand innovation management. The sense sometimes with these platforms is it's all now becoming automated. And what I'm hearing from you is that on the one hand, open innovation is very much more mature now, to the point that it can become systematized and adopted using something like a platform approach. But what we still need is this ability to think it through strategically, to recognize underneath it's about people exchanging ideas, moving knowledge around. It still needs that sort of wonderful, loose phrase, innovation management. So perhaps can I, as a last question, throw at you, we're having this conversation another 5 years down the road, and there's really been a sea change. So this is very positive. What has it been that really has made our organizations such effective innovation managers in a now well-organized and systemized open innovation world?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a very smart answer to it, other than perhaps rehashing some of the themes I've already talked about, John. So I think those organisations that culturally get it through and through will win. So people have open attitudes to their staff, their, as well as their procurement, their innovation. Yeah, innovation and procurement is a big line. So innovation is sort of playtime for a lot of companies, but when it comes to procurement, things get serious, right? And lots of things die in the so-called valley of death, as I'm sure you're aware. I think 9 years ago when we spoke last, I talked about innovation becoming mainstream, open innovation becoming mainstream, and I think it has achieved that. But crossing the divide between TRL 1 to 5 or 6, and then technology readiness level, that is, and then making it into how we procure stuff normally. That's a big thing, and I predict that will happen as organisations get more culturally comfortable with being open. I think open innovation is going to be much more prevalent within the public sector, simply because the 3 reasons you open innovate are still valid today as they were when it was invented. It gets you better innovation faster and cheaper than other ways of doing it, and governments need that stuff. They spend a lot of money. Governments do, and need to work better together cross-departmentally as well. So we've been running a program with Leicester, Manchester University, and others called the Global Innovation Policy Accelerator for the past 5 years. We've taken national governments, more than Newton Fund countries, so Newton Fund, a dozen or 15 countries, through how to be more open in policy making, and specifically how to make policy for open innovation within their market bases, whether it's Kenya or Malaysia. How do you set the conditions for open innovation? So I think it's gone up a rung. It's gone from businesses just doing it in spite of the political intellectual property rules to being encouraged on a national, on a local, regional, and national basis. So I think it's going to become more mainstream political thinking and mainstream policy making thinking that you have to create the right conditions for open innovation in your country or your town or your or your region. So talking to the new unitary authority in the northeast of England, for example, they've been seriously looking at open innovation and how that can radically change the fortunes of that particular region. And they've done a lot of research. They're going to have a whole bunch of competitions, and that's really exciting. So it's moved beyond a competitive advantage for traditional business and moved into the sort of warp and weft of the way countries and regions run. So I think I predict more of that.
Great.
As well.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and that's a lovely picture to sort of close on. Certainly this notion of openness moving from a nice idea, a nice sort of motherhood statement, to actually becoming embedded in, as you put it, the warp and weft. That's really a nice picture. David, thank you so much for your time and your fascinating insights. I hope it won't be too long before we can catch some more of them, but for now, thanks very much indeed.